Hey everyone, we are back with another webinar, and we have a fantastic guest on the other side who's going to talk all about value and how to sell value at scale. We have Alisha Chander on the webinar here, and it's great to have you. How are you doing, Alisha?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing great as well. It's one day before Thanksgiving, so it feels like
Yes.
everything is kind of getting a bit more silent these days. You see in the background, it's still dark, so nobody's working.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
uh,
Exactly.
can't complain. How are you?
It good. This is one of my favorite times of year in New York where the city is completely quiet and you get all the good restaurant reservations that you want and get to
Oh,
do what you want to do around the city. So it's really nice.
that's pretty cool. I can't imagine that for New York,
Yeah.
but it must be a
Yeah.
good time.
It's great. It's great.
Maybe you can tell us a bit more about the great things you've done in the last few years in your career. You've worked at Clari, you've worked at Slack, Salesforce, so a lot of great things. You've led the value team at Clari previously, so maybe you can tell us
Mhm.
a bit more about yourself and what you've been doing, what you've been up to, and then we can dig into some of the questions and thoughts that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. So most recently was at Clari, joined 2.5 years ago and built the value engineering team from the ground up and had a really fun time doing it. And so what it looked like at Clari was across the entire customer journey, which I'm sure we'll get into today a little bit more about that. But I'm a big proponent of making sure that value is throughout the entire customer interaction from awareness all the way through renewal and expansion. And then before that was also at Slack and Salesforce previously, where I kind of first got my value chops, if you will, and got to really experience tech and sales, and got to combine it with management consulting skill set and muscles, which was really fun. And prior to my life in tech, I was in finance and in banking. So I did a couple stints, in management consulting, so at Ernst and Young, helping large enterprise global organizations figure out how to basically maximize profit in the financial services sector, um, which became a lot of cost reduction, tough environment obviously, but you get to learn so much through that. And previous to that, General Electric, where I was in a rotational leadership program in finance. So kind of got to build foundational skill sets across FP&A and pricing and M&A, and got to really understand kind of the inner workings of, back of the house, if you will, in a financial services company and get, a really good exposure to the working environment too. Wouldn't trade any of those experiences for anything. And then most recently, I have been kind of doing my own thing. And so I have really enjoyed, while growing in the value space as a leader, being able to help other companies or other individuals who are either getting started in that space or wanting to bring in some sort of value type motion. And so I've been working with Series B2D companies on how to start their own self-service kind of value motion without necessarily hiring a full team yet because they're not in that stage, and really learning how to scale in that sort of activity as well.
Wow, what a career! And it's interesting how you um, like how diverse your background is with the different experiences you've had, and kind of how that all led to the stage where you're at right now. Of course, supporting other leaders and functional departments of like thinking about how they can approach value and integrate value into their like company setup. And we're going to talk about the specifics here, right? Because you mentioned Series B to D companies, and of course, that's often when companies start thinking about operationalizing some of the thoughts around value.
Mhm.
Maybe to take like half a step back, like maybe we can better frame the discussion around like why is value even important these days? Like why should a company like you mentioned, right, like a Series A, B, C, D company, and of course upwards, think about even looking into the topic of value these days? Like what does it mean? What does it mean to them? Maybe what have you learned over the last few years that you can share with people here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it's if you've like been around the value space more recently, it's been a really interesting thing to see happen where, in my opinion, so I got started in value, I think, gosh, 6 years ago, 7 years ago. I can't remember. Math is hard right now, pun not intended. But I think previously it was seen as this like very new logo, big chunky deals only that are super complicated type of activity. And it was only at the really large tech companies. So your Salesforce is SAP, Oracle, ServiceNow, et cetera. And those obviously now have like incredibly mature, well-established practices that are global. And I think that as we're starting to see this shift in companies that they're smaller companies getting into the enterprise selling kind of space, it becomes a really important activity to get right so that you're tailoring to what the customer actually is solving for versus just selling your product. And I think that the pandemic plus macro more recently has like exacerbated that even more. We're not in this environment where everything is hyper growth where it once was, as fun as that was. And so because of that, we're seeing a ton more scrutiny on every dollar spent. And that requires a business case, it requires exceptional selling, it requires a really tailored conversation once you start getting to those larger dollar values of, any sort of six-figure purchase. And so I think that is something that we're starting to see where you'll see the trend of, someone from finance at the table, probably from once the deal is qualified. You'll see potentially procurement involved much earlier on. In super large deals, you'll probably have a CFO evaluating as well. And so that's creating a lot of need for this more so than there was before, outside of just, selling in a more consultative way, which is also super important.
You mentioned a lot of great topics that I want to dig a bit deeper into. I think one of the things that we've been also seeing in the software space is that the rise of procurement software providers, right, that are essentially helping mid and larger organizations reduce their spends on that's related to software. So there's a lot of pressure, of course, from that entire market that's been developed over the last few years. And it kind of comes back to software providers selling their software and struggling with these procurement processes that have been bureaucratized and actually have been more complex and, of course, easier for the large corporate to handle everything. But essentially, it kind of creates some sort of pressure loop coming back to each and every seller that's trying to sell their software and trying to negotiate the best deal. You mentioned a few topics of like you actually have to be great at selling. You have to establish an understanding of like value and what it means for your product and your products in general. And generally enabling the organization to even proactively think about how they can address value in these conversations, which looking at it from the external could seem like a lot of things, right, to kind of manage, especially if you see already that like quotas are not being hit and you got to actually get to a certain point where you're about your forecast in the next few months and a couple of years. Like, how do you even get started so that you are at a certain point you are scalable in terms of like understanding and bring maybe more people that can lead the function? How do we think about the first couple steps?
Yeah, I think the first thing to get right, whether you have someone in place as like a value engineer or a head of value or anything, if you have one, great. If you don't, I think it's still possible to get started in value selling activities and motions. I think one of the biggest things to get right that I think is not unique, but like a skill of people who have this background. So for context, like I'll generalize, right? Because there's obviously a population of folks that are not, but most times value consultants, value engineers, business value people, whatever you want to call it, they are typically ex-management consultants or something along those lines. And something that you get really good at in management consulting is asking great questions. And so that brings me to this of, I will never say that I am a seller or that I would be good at selling. That is an account executive's job and they're incredible at it. But I will say that I'm probably pretty good at discovery, as is anyone who I would hire or bring in for a value role. And some of the best sellers that I've seen are incredible at discovery too. And so the question is then like, okay, what is good discovery and what do you do with that? And I think the thing that I keep in mind is, your classic things like open-ended questions and, try to size the problem and things like that. But I think it's also understanding how to pivot in a conversation and scan across a number of topics, and then figure out how you actually want to deep dive and get kind of precision into your questions eventually. What you'll end up seeing sometimes is whoever is conducting the discovery, sometimes it can be value people too. We're not immune to this, is that we'll find a topic that's really juicy in the conversation and we'll just like laser focus on it and we'll spend all of our time there. But instead, we need to also understand the bigger picture. What are all the factors at play? And then figure out, okay, what are the places? It's like it's like a discovery battleship game, if you will. Like, figure out then where do you want to zero in and keep asking why across those things. So why is that painful? Why is that being painful such a big deal to you? What are you trying to solve by actually removing this pain? Why is solving that pain so important to you? And so then you're ultimately getting to some larger topics that might be more at an executive level or goal across the organization. I know that was a total monologue just now, but hopefully that was helpful.
It was great. And your dog chimed in as well, which is always
yeah. he probably will throughout this.
Which is awesome. He's a good guest on the value webinar.
Thank you so much. He's a value professional by trade as well.
I'm sure he is, with the amount of things that he's heard over the last few years.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We can bring him in as like a special guest down the road.
Yeah, perfect.
What you talked about questions to ask, right, in discovery, and I feel like talking to a lot of sales reps these days that oftentimes it's the tough questions that are not being asked, and the tough questions that actually should lead you to a better value-oriented discussion that are not being asked essentially in these sales journeys. Like, what are maybe a couple of questions, and I know that's very specific and tactical, but maybe you can remember a couple of questions that you've seen work quite well in order to at least initiate a first value discussion with your prospect. What are a couple of things that maybe take away?
So I think before you even get to the discussion, and so many reps are great at this, but it's worth repeating, is doing homework on the customer. So like going in with some understanding of, I don't know, for like a public company, it might be their 10K, 10Q, or their annual report, or a certain like investor call that they just had, where you're uncovering some things that are, seeming to be really important to the executive team. And you're able to at least have like a warm start into the conversation that way. With a private company, it's obviously a lot harder because they're not having, releases like that or publications that they're putting out there publicly. But, there can be things like podcasts that the founders do, or things like, a press release that's gone out recently, or an acquisition they've made, or whatever it is, that can help at least like inform you. And I think one of the biggest things that I learned in consulting that I repeat all the time, and if like any of my former team is listening, they will laugh at this, is that just have something for someone to react to. Like, it is so much easier to have something that someone can say, no, that's not right, versus asking someone, well, what do you care about? It's a lot easier for someone to correct you. And you don't have to go in thinking that you're right. You can just say, hey, this is what I've heard or seen. Could you help guide me? And I think once you're there, then you're in this interesting situation where, one of the things that I tell or I guide reps to try to do, and I try to guide myself to do too, is when you're in a call with a prospect or even like an existing customer, if you're doing like, a post-sales type of activity, is like take your product out of the equation for a minute and literally say that, like, let's be agnostic of us. Like, what do you care about right now? Like, what is top of mind for you? And I think that's like one of the most important things to ask, because sometimes we'll get narrow and we'll say, well, what are your sales problems? What are your problems in your sales org? Or what are problems in your marketing org? Or, how's the productivity of the team? And we'll get really, really specific, and we might miss this whole other thing that's going on. And so I think that becomes really important because fast forward, when it's time to actually close the deal, you have now figured out what are the, like the three things that they are so focused on that you can then, right, align your project with in maybe multiple ways or multiple threads to strengthen your value prop. And there's obviously a ton of questions that have to go in between, but that would be one of the places where I'd start. And I'd always emphasize someone starts.
Yeah, it's super, super interesting. You mentioned a few things. Like one, I mean, doing your research, right? And even we had a webinar with Eric Shaver, who has also done a lot of research and consulting on helping companies sell to C-level executives and being more financially driven about how you pitch your business case. And one of the things that also came up, which also you kind of came back to, is like really understanding your customer situation and trying to research. And sometimes it's for public companies reading through the public reports and trying to understand the strategic priorities of the board, right, and how you can actually align with some of these initiatives. And then, of course, other parts where the conversation that you're having is often, like, of course, directed from a hypothesis, right, that you might have about the customer. I think there's this even like whole notion about hypothesis-based selling these days, which of course can be
Exactly.
combined with value of like coming in with hypothesis, trying to understand the customer, whether your hypothesis about their situation is right, and then navigating from there to make a better call, to make a better basically next step going into a demo.
I just want to interrupt quickly. Like, I think I haven't heard the term like hypothesis-based selling, but like from what it sounds like, I would actually say that that is value selling. Like that's exactly what I mean by like going and doing your research and having some assumptions. You're fast forwarding and figuring out what are the potential outcomes that would be important to them. And they're there to correct your hypothesis or your assumptions. And so I would just say like, I think there's a bunch of different names for what sellers should be doing today. I won't say any of them because I don't want to like speak out of turn and get in trouble with people, but I think there's a lot of different names for things now. And at the end of the day, if you're talking about the customer's outcomes and ultimately what they care about, agnostic of you and your company, then you at the heart, I think, are like in a way starting value-based selling because you're focused on the customer's value that they're getting. And so there's obviously ways that you can get more scientific and more precise about doing it, but it doesn't have to also be this like over engineered item as well either.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for adding that. I think again the terms can be thrown around in different forms. At the end, it all comes like boils down to the similar kind of thoughts and ideas.
Yeah.
And, I mean, when we look at value, right, we talked a little bit about the pre-sales part of things, where you try to understand the customer and you go into the discovery and you want to lead a value-oriented discussion from basically that first conversation to closing. What should people consider in general when they think about value, right? Because oftentimes what we're seeing also is like people care about the customer's post-sales value initiatives that are kind of coming into play. Do you think people should start with one or the other? Do you think it should be thought out through from like beginning till end through the entire customer journey? Or what have you learned works quite well, especially as people kind of get going and get started with value? What are things that you've learned there?
It's a really good question. It's a really big question. So I think there's a couple of different ways to look at it. I guess all signs for me, or all answers that I will say, will point to that it's really important across the entire journey. And that's from like your product marketing all the way through them signing back on and renewing or expanding their footprint with you. There's places where you might not be as heavily involved or like I guess to asterisk this, right? That does not mean that you have to have someone supporting from your value team, like hands on in each of those areas. Like you don't have to have, value supporting. Apologize, my dog is making quite the appearance right now. Doesn't mean you have to have someone in like every facet. It does mean though that your value org or whoever is running this type of motion needs to at least influence across those areas. So I would say like if you're hiring for a value leader, it needs to be a very equal mix of someone who's like incredibly analytical and a little theoretical, but also someone who is has the ability to influence really indirectly as well. Because at the end of the day, we don't hold a quota, we don't own a team outside of us. And so to get off that tangent though, I'd say that like the biggest places are going to be new logo. It's going to be in post sales. So that can look like customer success or account management, depending on how your teams are broken up. And I'd say that there's also going to be an element of that all feeding back to the marketing engine. So what you're getting out of it is going to go back to marketing. And that might look like case studies. It might look like feedback that you're getting in deal cycles that can influence, many to one assets. And so I think your other question was like, where do you start in all of those? I think that that's really dependent on the business. So most places where I've started it is a new logo because it's sometimes a faster start to get something started as a brand new fresh prospect. But I could also see that for, consumption businesses are like, there's so many now and it's becoming kind of the norm to have a consumption based business. It's so hyper important in that you're realizing value and that the customer understands that you're realizing value. So you can, get more consumption going or continue to like have consumption happen in a steady pace.
Yeah, and it's interesting that that's a specific kind of niche that you've also been seeing, kind of where maybe value on the post-sale side is more and more important. One of the things that you also mentioned is kind
Super
of
important.
how it feels back to product marketing, right? And one of the things that we've been seeing over and over again is that customers want to have more benchmarks to work with because they are facing customers that don't necessarily trust the business case just by putting out assumptions from like external markets or like external research studies that have been basically conducted, but it's more about like what have other customers achieved that are in similar industries and similar situations, and tell me more about that. And oftentimes sellers and AEs are struggling to get access to benchmark data from other customers, which essentially kind of comes back to what you said, delivering that loop of like maybe you start with the pre-sale side, you lead into the post-sale side of things, and then you kind of fuel it back to marketing and product marketing, and then they kind of help the sellers actually deliver better conversations again on the pre-sale side, right? So it's like a constant loop that needs to be delivered in order to ensure that value keeps a constant or is a constant in an organization.
Yeah, and I think that so hard plus on the benchmarks piece, we successfully did that at Clari, and we built kind of a internal product for it, if you will. And I think it's one of the biggest things that we did personally to be able to help our post-sales teams in their conversations. There's obviously so many other use cases that go beyond it of benchmarks that you can aggregate and all these things. But I think that's also something that I'm kind of bullish on too for other companies that I may join in the future or help or just see in general, that like the data-driven value teams are going to be the ones that are very successful, both just in general, but also in scaling, that they're able to leverage their own products data. Like I obviously was at Salesforce, and that was really challenging for us to do given the size and acquisitions and all these things. So that was a manual kind of survey-based benchmarking that was done. And that has its own merits. It has its own cons as well, in some ways, but having kind of the empirical data to go off of and then leverage how you want to, obviously in a super ethical, like privacy concerned way, is a total game changer to be able to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think that is one of the, like, it's crazy that you have built like an internal product, right? That's like showcases the importance of that topic and how it's helping sales reps at the end. You mentioned a couple of things that I'm excited about, like now where it's more about the advancement of value, right? You talked initially about like what happens if you hire a first value leader or a first value engineer, which of course is already a more advanced step. And now even thinking about utilizing post-sale data and kind of bring that back into the pre-sales process again, that's some of the more kind of advanced setup, I would say, or at least it kind of gets us there. What are the things people consider from, okay, maybe they've started kind of thinking about value. They have like taught their sellers to ask them more value-oriented discovery questions, and that showcases like great conversion rate in terms of like first to second meetings and all that kind of stuff. But what is a good kind of next level that people can achieve? What can they think about to get more advanced even? Like what are things that they might be even considering if they already have done
Yeah,
value?
I mean, I think the next step after discovery is naturally like being able to do a business case, whether it's financially like grounded or if it's a qualitative business case. And I think getting that right is really important. And it's not, in my opinion, right, it's not like putting numbers on a slide and calling it a day. It's actually like the storytelling behind it is paramount. And it like, I'm going to sound like a broken record, right? But it's all based off of discovery and actually learning about the customer. Because like there may be a story that you guys have in your first call deck and your second call deck or whatever it is, your classic demo of like how your solution serves the typical customer. But that's not why a customer has engaged in a sales cycle with you. And so I think figuring out, what is the right but simple business case to provide. And so what I mean by that is something that is the customer will understand very easily if you were to hand over the Excel to them. And it's non-complicated in terms of, how you get to the answers and how you get from like a feature to a use case to the outcome. Like that has to be very, very clear in the storytelling. And then I think being able to then also have kind of that like really succinct 5-slide business case summary that you would integrate into probably like a larger readout. So it feels like it's part of the deal, not just this like extra activity that you did. Those are going to be probably the two biggest pieces along with it. And I think like the other thing to just keep in mind too is because theoretically you've started this with like improving discovery, your motion will have started pretty like early into your deal cycle. So let's say like as when the deal is qualified, this should feel like this shouldn't feel like something extra that's going on in the deal to the customer. This shouldn't feel like this like whole separate stream of activity that they have to keep track of or manage or feel not responsible for, but feel like it's sucking up their time. The best ones, right, are like where you're integrating it into the natural flow of the cycle. And it feels like, well, of course, this is just how we always sell. Because the opposite of that is just slamming it in at like the week before, a couple days before you want to present commercials. And it's like, you might as well just not even do it at that point. And so I think that's the other like, level of getting to advanced, if you will, of being able to make it like a very, like sophisticated value motion in pre-sales.
Yeah, running in like separate streams is something that I feel like is the worst thing that you can do, right? Even in thinking about what is the role again of a value engineer or sometimes solution engineers, if you don't have a value team, that they kind of help the AEs in supporting the value discussion there as well, and kind of getting a bit deeper
Yeah.
on like the roots of the business problem that the customer has. So
You
I
might
feel
have some different meetings just to like call
right.
out, right? Like you might have a few separate meetings, but like it shouldn't feel like this totally separate hustle. And sorry to talk over you. I just wanted to mention that.
It's exactly the point, right? I think there's a controversial aspect to that, right? Where I think at the end it's one team and the customer, like thinking from the customer's perspective,
Mm-hmm.
talk to 100 different people in 100 different conversations. They want to have one aligned journey, and values, of
Yeah.
course, an important puzzle piece of that because they need to be selling it to their CFO. It's interesting that you mentioned like preparing some of the assets and creating the story, right? How do you like, and of course I'm curious, like, would you agree that like you need some sort of standardization and consistency there, right? Because you could build a story for
Mm-hmm.
every customer, but that's not going to scale, right? Coming back to our title of the webinar, like getting to
Of
value at
course.
scale. Where does the link happen between like the product marketing work and everything that's being created on defining use cases and the framework to then like execute on that? And is that enough most of the time to kind of build a story that is compelling for most of your customers, 80-90% of your customers' conversation? Or How do you think about that?
I think that it the answer is gonna be it depends a little bit on a couple things. One, do you have a more transactional business, or is it like a much more like tailored, bespoke deal cycle? If it's the latter, then I think that standardized assets, like a standardized story, a standardized deck, etc., it probably gets you to like 75% of what you need. And then it's on the rep or the value engineer or the SE or whoever is going to be, participating, or all three, to then take it that like last mile. Um, I think if you have a more transactional business, or if this is like serving a more down market sort of segment, so like commercial, mid commercial, etc., then it's probably going to solve like 95% of your deals just out of the standardized side. And so that's actually something that I've done in the past, is have a specific asset for enterprise level customers that we know we're going to, maybe the business case, like the financials, the way that we get there doesn't change a lot, but the actual like qualitative storytelling changes a little bit, and we alter some of it. And over time, right, we have things to leverage, and we can kind of piece things together pretty quickly if it's not this like super different type of situation. And then for anything below enterprise, we basically solved it with self-serve assets that were completely standardized, that we could scale across the business. And so, that might look like your own Google Sheets that you ship out to reps to pull from. It might look like a solution like Minoa. But there's different options for that. But I think it depends on what you're solving for.
Well, thanks for sharing. Just kind of one last question as we kind of
Yeah.
up. How do you measure the success of value? That's something that kind of comes up a bit. And like, how do you, when looking back at kind of the implementation of even bringing on a team and kind of setting the structure, what are things that sales leaders, CROs can think about to maybe even initiate more investments into that function, or at least the enablement? What would you look into in terms of measurement?
Yeah. So on like the hard metric side, I would say one, revenue is going to be the hard, like the biggest one. One, revenue, or like win rate in general. And what I would encourage is like to figure like to through Salesforce or whatever your CRM is, to figure out some sort of like tagging or tracking system through that. So you can look at other things tied to the opportunity. Eventually, once you have a much more mature program, so let's say like a year to 2 years out, you can probably start looking at other sides of that. So initially, right, it might be value influenced revenue versus not, and then value influenced win rate versus if you didn't have value in the business and what that looked like historically or in that period. And then you might start to be able to look at like, okay, the deals that value worked on, was the discount rate on average, less? Was the deal cycle time perhaps like shorter? Were certain stages shorter? I don't know. You can start looking at like more granular things there. I think the qualitative piece of it is twofold. One is just overall adoption of value methodology and assets. So that you can probably pretty easily track if you get like your kind of tagging and stuff down in Salesforce. And it's something that I personally use to actually give feedback to the frontline managers and the VPs of like, here, let's look at your reps are having these win rates individually. Here's how they're adopting value. Like maybe there's something that we can do here to fill the gap, or to like fix this a little bit. And I think the other one too is, and this is like very soft, right? But it's also just like rep feedback and like sales feedback. That is going to speak louder than anything. And you'll know really quickly based on their feedback and what they're saying. And like that's almost like the pre-indicator of all these other ones. And so if they are liking the assets, then great, they're going to use them a ton, and they're going to want to pull you into deals and pull your team into deals and all these sorts of things. If they think that they're hard to use, or they're over-engineered, or hard to manage, or they're just really not fit for purpose, then if you're not accepting that feedback, then that's kind of like you're writing your own story there.
Great summary. And like looking at the two aspects of like there's the individual feedback and then there's kind of the macro feedback on the
I'll
large.
add one more.
Please,
Sorry. I'll add
please.
one more. Customer feedback.
Oh, okay.
Customer feedback is massive. There's so many times at at some of the places that I helped build a team and at Clari, like we would get feedback from the customer directly or the champion of like, this is really useful. This is fitting the bill, or we haven't seen something this like put together, packaged like this before. This felt like a partnership. And so things like that you can look out for or gather feedback from. And sometimes in the bad way too, like this was too complicated or this was like so over engineered. But that is another indicator too that I would really look out for.
Amazing. Thanks, Alisha. And I know we're right on time. Thanks for
Yeah.
all your thoughts and like helping people better navigate through this journey of like establishing it, but then also getting more advanced. I think we nicely covered the two kind of stages and how you move from one to the other, and even being tactical about it, being more strategic about it. I think we kind of move between the levels, which is always a fun endeavor. So thanks for your time and kind of your thoughts. And how can people reach out? Like, what's the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, I think on LinkedIn is probably the easiest. I'm pretty responsive. So just reach out to me there and send me a message and I will get back to you. And I'd love to chat.
Awesome. Thanks, Alisha.
Thanks.